Hey, what's up everyone, Ollie here. So I've been using the iPhone 13 Pro for the past week or so now, and I've got to say, I actually think this is one of the most underrated updates for the iPhone. Let's get into it. The design is unchanged, looking pretty much the same as the 12 Pro from last year. The only notable difference is the larger camera bump and the smaller notch. To be honest though, I haven't even really noticed the smaller notch on the device because it just blends in so well with the interface anyway. It is slightly thicker, and at first you probably wouldn't even notice, but if you had this and the 12 Pro side by side, you might do. I love this design though. As I've said previously, I actually think this is my favorite looking iPhone. Before that, it was the iPhone 4. I've also said previously that Apple do such a good job of making their phones feel like pieces of jewelry. It just feels so nice in the hand. The smooth and glossy stainless steel band feels very expensive, just makes it look super expensive. It does attract fingerprints, but I still love it. Same with the sharp edges and the matte finish on the back. I really do like the aesthetic design of this phone. But there is one thing that's functionally wrong with the design of this phone. But before I get into it, I did want to thank the sponsor of this video, Rhino Shield. Rhino Shield make cases and screen protectors for all types of devices, and they've just launched cases for all of the new iPhones. Their cases can provide various degrees of protection, but I have the solid suit here. It's a minimalistic case that's ideal for everyday use. It's 3mm thin and weighs only 30 grams, but it's still strong enough to protect your phone from accidental drops, scrapes and scratches. The solid suitcase can also be customized on the Rhino Shield website. You can choose case color, material, and even add a print design if that's your thing. I have a bunch of different cases here, and you can see you can have pretty much any style that you like, anything that suits you. Considering how expensive these phones are getting now, it's always worth having a case on your phone to protect your investment. So make sure to check out Rhino Shield. Use my code OLIA to get 20% off in the first week. I'll leave a link to it down in the description below. Going back to what I think is wrong functionally with the design of this phone, and that is that massive camera bump. We'll get into what the camera can do later in the video, but the number one issue I've had is using standard wireless chargers. The camera bump sticks out so much that I have to spend a lot more time lining up the phone to make sure it's charging. And it's even worse if you have a case on your phone, as most cases usually have a lip to protect the camera bump. It's just a little annoying, and it makes the sort of experience of just being able to plop your phone down on a wireless charger a bit less smooth. I mean, I could change all of my wireless chargers to MagSafe, but that would just be a waste of wireless chargers, and then I've got to spend a lot more money getting all of these MagSafe chargers as well. A15 Bionic. So this year, all of the iPhone 13s come with the A15 Bionic chip. Now, one notable thing when it comes to the 13 Pro and the Pro Max is that you have an extra GPU core compared to the standard 13 and 13 mini. So the Pros now have 5-core GPUs compared to the 4-core GPUs that you get in the standard models. That should mean better graphics performance on the Pro models, but when compared to my 12 Pro, I'll be honest, I'm not actually seeing too much of a difference when it comes to performance. Now, that's not a bad thing. The A14s were already just so good. The A15s just seem to be a bit more efficient and a little bit more powerful. I have no complaints when it comes to performance. It's as zippy as I expected it to be, and I'm sure anyone else who purchases one will find it quick. And the great thing about these chips are as well, that you can buy an iPhone like this and have it last for years and not really have any performance issues. Battery life. So the battery life on the 13 Pro is noticeably better compared to last year's 12 Pro. I can easily go a day now with pretty heavy use. I'm getting around 7 hours of screen on time, which is amazing. I use my phone a lot for Twitter, Instagram and Reddit. Now, they're not exactly the most resource intensive apps, but I think it's a good representation of what most people use their phones for. And I think if I'm getting that sort of battery life using those sorts of apps, most people should be fine. With very light use, I think you could get 2 days out of it, and I'm sure with the 13 Pro Max it's even better. Battery life is technically very hard to measure because everyone uses their phone differently. Even something like being in an area with poor cellular signal will make you burn your battery quicker, as the phone is working harder to stay connected. Apple say on their website that the 13 Pro gives you 1.5 hours more battery life and 2.5 hours more on the Pro Max. But something interesting I learned when speaking to Apple is that these battery life numbers that they get, 1.5 hours, 2.5 hours, aren't in absolutely perfect conditions. So when you set up your phone for the first time, usually you get a screen that says, would you like to share data and diagnostics with Apple? They're actually using that data from hundreds of thousands, millions of iPhones, and seeing what sort of battery life each of those people are getting and how much different it is compared to previous models. So yeah, it's not perfect case scenario. It is actually based on real world usage. ProMotion is a big pro feature of these Pro versions of the iPhone. That is a lot of pros. But anyway, ProMotion means that the screen can now output at 120 Hz compared to the previous 60 Hz. This is one of those things which is hard to illustrate on camera. You've got to see it in person. But I have some slow motion footage here, 120 frames per second footage, and you can see the difference between the 12 Pro next to the 13 Pro. You can see how the animations are smoother, and that's because there are now twice the number of frames in the animation. I love it, and it's a great pro feature to have, but that's because I feel like I can appreciate it. I've had friends and family who really aren't into tech at all try out 13 Pro to see if they can notice the difference. And I'll be honest, none of them noticed the difference at all. I think it very much is aimed at pro users like myself. The only way I could get them to actually tell the difference was to have a standard 12 Pro and then the 13 Pro side by side. That's the only way they could actually tell that the animations were smoother. But even then, they couldn't actually work out what was smoother. They just knew that it was smoother. But again, like I said, I think this feature is more for pro users, so it makes sense that it's on the iPhone 13 Pro. A neat feature that Apple have also implemented when it comes to ProMotion is that it can change between 10 Hz to 120 Hz. And the reason for that is it actually saves battery life. If the screen was running at 120 Hz constantly, that would absolutely burn through battery life. So when you're doing things like reading some text or just have a static image on the screen, it will only be at 10 Hz. But as soon as you start scrolling, going through apps or whatever else, it will change to 120 Hz. So it can dynamically adapt so that it doesn't burn through your battery life. The screen is also brighter now, topping out at 1200 nits, which should make it easier to see outside. So the triple camera setup is definitely the headline feature of the 13 Pros this year, and it's something Apple spent a lot of time on in the keynote. Up top, you have the telephoto lens, which now has a 77mm focal length and an f2.8 aperture. In the middle is an ultra wide, which has a 13mm focal length and an f1.8 aperture. And at the bottom is the standard wide lens that has a 26mm focal length and 1.5 aperture. All cameras are at 12 megapixels. Interestingly, the telephoto lens now has a longer focal length, but it doesn't let in as much light as last year. And the best analogy I have for this is that you've got to imagine looking down a sort of tube. The longer the tube, the less light it gives in, but it does mean you're sort of more zoomed in, you're focused in on a smaller area. And that's exactly what's happening with the telephoto lens. Because it's focused in on a smaller area and the lens isn't actually bigger, less light actually comes into the lens. This results in the aperture going from f2.0 from last year to f2.8 this year. The ultra wide has now seen an aperture increase. It's now f1.8 instead of 2.4. This means that it should let in a lot more light and should result in better low light pictures as well as better noise performance. This was actually my biggest complaint with the previous ultra wides. If you didn't shoot in a lot of light, the images would end up looking a little bit noisy and just a bit muddy. The ultra wide is also now capable of macro photography. It's a super cool feature to have and makes for some interesting photos. To enable macro photography though, is something that oddly there is no option for in the camera app. You have to bring the phone closer to the subject and it will automatically change to macro mode. Apple have said though that they're actually going to be changing that in a future software update, so you should be able to choose macro photography. Finally, we have the wide camera. This camera now has a better aperture of 1.5, which should result in even better low light pictures, better than all of the cameras on the 13 Pro. Also this year, it now has sensor shift image stabilization on the 13 Pro as well as the 13 Pro Max. Last year, sensor shift was only limited to the 12 Pro Max. As expected, all of the cameras are really good, and I'm a fan of the pictures that can be taken with something that just fits in your pocket. I also like to shoot in RAW so that I can edit the pictures to my liking, adding my own Lightroom presets and just getting the look that I want. It's pretty incredible to see how far cameras have come, considering, like I said, this just fits in your pocket. There's a picture I saw comparing the cameras from the first iPhone to the current iPhone 13 Pro, and it's just crazy to see how much more of a phone is now taken up by the camera. I'm super into my photography, so this won't be replacing my Sony mirrorless camera anytime soon for all of the sort of pro photography that I do, because typically, if you want really good high quality pictures, you need bigger sensors and bigger lenses. Well, not bigger lenses, but high quality lenses. And I feel like, you know, with an iPhone, with something this small, there's only so much of a sensor that you can fit in here without the phone becoming really, really bulky. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Hopefully, as hardware and software starts getting better, we get even better cameras. But I think right now, the only way to get better pictures in a phone is to put bigger sensors in them. Cinematic mode. So this was a big feature that Apple highlighted in the keynote. It's a new function of the video camera that's supposed to give you more of a sort of cinematic look, you could say. Cinematic mode appears as a separate mode in the camera app next to the video mode. Once it's selected, it will automatically focus on a person's face if they're in the frame, or you can tap to focus on a subject. There's also an f-stop button in the top left, which you can use to artificially change the amount of blur. It brings up an f-stop dial, which you can change between 2.0 and 16. Cinematic mode is a cool feature, and I can see where it can be used, but I personally am just not a fan, mainly because I feel like the artificial blur is just too artificial looking for me. I've gotten so used to using professional cameras like this, where, you know, I just feel like I've become a camera snob, you could say, where I can see when something's artificial and when something is actual camera blur, like you're getting from this camera that I'm using to record this video. And yeah, it just doesn't do it for me. But hopefully, as software becomes better, as more and more people use cinematic mode, Apple can get the data, they can see all of that data and get even better cinematic mode. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see, because the biggest issue I have with cinematic mode is the edges. The edges just look way too artificial, and if there's lots of detail, especially around hair or maybe plants or something like that, yeah, it just struggles to get the artificial blur right. So one thing I'm still looking for, and I'm disappointed that the iPhone 13 Pro doesn't have, is USB-C. It still uses Lightning, and Lightning just isn't that great anymore. I mean, the connector is fine, but the data transfer speeds and the charging speeds just doesn't match the competition. There have been rumors of a totally portless iPhone, which makes sense, but at the same time, I feel like we're way off, mainly because developers need an actual direct connection for debugging. And you know, if maybe you have like a bricked iPhone or something, and Apple needs to get into it, maybe unbrick it or whatever, most likely they're going to connect it up to something. So unless they come up with some sort of way to connect to an iPhone wirelessly and do data transfer and debugging, all these different things, yeah, I just don't see a portless iPhone coming in the next year or two. It might be a few more years, but yeah, technology can change quickly, so a portless iPhone would be great. I'm looking forward to seeing one if it does ever happen. So even though there was no redesign this year or any sort of game-changing features, what I think makes the 13 Pro such a great phone is all of the incremental updates. Apple have taken what was an already great phone and just made updates that people actually wanted. Things like better battery life, better cameras, and a better screen. The life cycle of a phone has also changed. I feel as though they're coming closer and closer to the life cycle of a computer. Most people don't upgrade to the latest laptop every year when there are new updates. They can wait anywhere between 2 to 5 years or even longer for an update. Smartphones have just gotten so good that you don't need to update every year. If you're someone who has a 12 Pro, probably isn't worth upgrading to a 13 Pro. But if you're someone who has an 11 and older, I feel like this would make a good upgrade. So I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter and subscribe for more.